Hello, good evening. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the GSD is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. I'd like to remind our virtual audience that we have live captioning available. To enable captions, please click the closed captioning button at the bottom of the live stream window. I also want to invite you to join us for an upcoming GSD public program this Friday, April 21st at 1 p.m. for a symposium celebrating the 3rd Annual Mayor's Institute on City Design and Just City Mayoral Fellowship, a collaboration between the MICD and Harvard's GSD's Just City Lab. And now for tonight's event, I'm delighted to welcome Tosin Oshinowo, who will be delivering the Aga Khan Program Lecture, supported by GSD's Aga Khan Program, which is part of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at Harvard and MIT, dedicated to the study of Islamic art, architecture, urbanism, landscape design, and conservation. Tosin is a Lagos-based Nigerian architect and designer renowned for expansive residential and commercial projects and her socially responsible approaches to urbanism. Grounded in her native Yoruba culture and history and coming from an African context, Tosin's designs embody a contemporary perspective on the next generation of African design and Afro-minimalism, a responsive reflection of the past, present, and future that prioritizes sustainability, resilience, and poise. As an architect, Tosin is best known as the founder and principal of CM Design Atelier, established in 2012 and based in Lagos. The practice has undertaken a number of prominent civic projects, including the design of the Maryland Mall in Lagos, as well as residential projects that include many beach houses on the coast of this oceanside city. Her interest in architecture extends into a broader vision of urbanism and community. She is currently working on a project with the United Nations Development Program in Northeast Nigeria, designing a new community for a village displaced by Boko Haram. As a product designer, Tosin is well known for her design for chairs. In 2017, she created Ile Ila, which means house of lines in her native Yoruba language. They are made to order, designed, and handmade in Lagos and have been featured in publications from Harper's Bazaar Interiors to Elle Decor as an exemplar of contemporary African furniture design. Beyond the scales of architecture, urbanism, and furniture, Tosin's work expands into the spheres of publications, public engagements, and exhibitions. Her writings have appeared in expansions as part of the Venice Architectural Biennale, as well as Omenka Online on the topic she also explored in her TED Talk at Port Harcourt. From the perspective of exhibitions, she has partnered with Lexus on the conceptual designs for Design Miami. She's also co-curated the second Lagos Biennale, titled How to Build a Lagoon from a Bottle of Wine. She's currently the curator of the second edition of the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, an international platform highlighting the architecture of the African continent as well as West and South Asia. The title of Tosin's Triennial is The Beauty of Impermanence, an Architecture of Adaptability, where she explores how practitioners across the global South employ contextual and contemporary techniques to build a world that is more sustainable, more equitable, and more community-oriented than most celebrated standard practices. In a lecture tonight titled Ashe, Intentional Contextuality and Adaptability in Design, Tosin will share some of the core themes emerging from the triennial, the proposals of some participants. She will address the theme of adaptability and the focus on socially responsive approaches. She will also address the importance of embracing context and local solutions and ways of understanding the global challenges posed by resource extraction and climate change from the perspective of the global South. So please join me in welcoming Tosin Oshinowo.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Tosin Oshinowo. I'm an architect, and I live and run a practice in Lagos called CM Design Atelier. Lagos is one of the most populated cities in Africa, with an estimated 15.3 million people. I am Yoruba, a West African ethnic group mainly inhabiting parts of Nigeria, Benin, and Togo. If you've watched the 2020 movie, The King Women, the Yorubas were the bad guys. Outside of Africa, the Yoruba diaspora consists of two main groupings. The first being that of the Yorubas dispersed mainly to the New World between the 16th and 19th centuries, notably to Cuba and Brazil. And the second consisting of a wave of relatively recent migrants, the majority of whom began to migrate to the United Kingdom and the United States, following some economic and political changes encountered in Africa from the 1960s onwards. I mention my ethnicity because it's synonymous with my existence. These statues are called Ere Ibeji. Ere Ibeji is an Orisha, a deity representing a pair of twins in Yoruba. In my culture and spirituality, twins are believed to be magical and granted protection from the Orisha Shongo. However, if one twin dies, it represents a bad omen for the parents and the society they belong to. The parents therefore commission a babalawo to carve a wooden ibeji to represent the deceased twin, and the parents take care of the figure like it's a real person. By Yoruba beliefs, the first of the twins is called Taiwo, and the second is called Kende. The second twin is considered to be the elder twin because Kende sends Taiwo to see if the world is fit and good before he or she descends. 1 in 10 births in the southwestern part of Nigeria, where the Yoruba are indigenous, are twins. My second name is Kende. I am indeed the younger twin. I mention this to highlight the importance of context and the relevance of my culture and contextuality, which I intentionally incorporate into my work. I will give this lecture in 4 parts. The first part, I will explain the principle of Ashe. In the second, I will highlight the importance of this principle in concerning the African context and our architectural evolution. In the third, I will explain my experiences and how this has influenced my practice. And finally, how I relate this to the theme of the 2023 Sharjah Architecture Triennial. Ashe is a philosophical concept the Yoruba defined to represent the power that makes things happen and produce change. In effect, it's an affirmation. I relate Ashe in architecture to the intentional contextuality of materiality. How this represents itself is not just the intention to work with nature, but the importance it plays in creating identity and contextuality of place. To understand this, we need to appreciate industrialization's role in influencing this principle, and the importance of traditional technologies and the tensions between natural constructs and global urbanization. Malthus, an English economist and demographer, had a theory on the relationship between population growth and food supply. Living in the 18th and 19th centuries, he observed that population growth is potentially exponential, while food supply and other resources are linear. His theory was that if food supply wasn't developed, it would eventually lead to population die-off. Technological advances have allowed for increased food supply, having increased supply, and our population has grown beyond exponential. We can see here the growth from the 1700s, which marked the birth of what we now have as the modern city. This illustration of Benin, constructed between the 18 and 1400s AD, is an excellent example of how most land movement was experienced on foot. With services and supplies concentrated in the center of cities, the developmental radius of the heart of the city was limited to about a mile, about the walking distance of a person for 30 minutes. This meant that most of the materials used for building, irrespective of location, would have been sourced locally. This series of images, taken in the 1970s, is of a palace in Kano, applying the final layer of waterproofing plaster, called makuba, to the walls. This contextuality has a natural cycle of life, like the human body, a process of replenishment and renewal. Pre-industrialization, innovation occurred in contextual materiality, creating architecture with an identity and cultural relevance. How do we address and reflect these principles today in our ever-globalizing world? In modernity, how do we encourage innovation contextually through building materiality? With this in mind, how can we retain the cultural relevance of a place and its identity? How do we relate contextual materiality towards the requirement of our urbanized world's need for speed and scale? My recently completed project in northeastern Nigeria required a lot of regional travel. I noticed several traditional settlements along the flight path just before you enter Lagos. It surprised me how many people away from urban areas still live along these principles of contextuality. This Google image, taken in May 2021, is of one such settlement of an Nigerian community, alive and well. This pointing case highlights the importance of context and culture in architecture. Pre- and post-colonial Africa, the house is the center of the world. For example, our use of space is not centered around an interior. This image of a Dakumba compound is typical of a compound house in various variations across the continent. This research here, done by Nana Ofusu and Bushra Mohammed into the compound house, shows that across the continent, though vast and diverse, the sense of community is a social construct common and reflected in this typology. Even the modern home today has layers of public and private spaces that are achieved like this traditional counterpart. But back to how this relates to industrialization. Our modernity will continue to be marked by rural-urban migration. As a result, the need for speed and scale is more relevant to sustain our humanity than ever before. But to understand this further, we need to understand how industrialization and modernity's role has been affected across the continent. To do this, we need to review the influence of colonialism. The period after World War II into the 1970s saw the liberalization of a continent that resulted in forming economies, developing cities, and largely rural settlements. This liberalization and subsequent cultural emancipation came with a promise of economic prosperity, manifested by the recasting of modernism as nationalism. Modernism offered a blank canvas and the opportunity to build a neo-equitable identity that negated ethnic diversity and cultural expression, which was necessary for African societies emerging from colonial rule. With this came tropical modernism, a design movement creating modernist buildings that principled climate-conducive design. This illustration celebrates Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew's work in West Africa, and the Breeze block also became a symbol of this period. These tessellation pattern-forming blocks use natural air movement across sunny and shaded parts to cool the structure and create privacy. These principles are relevant and appropriate for using concrete in the tropics and supported a nationalist identity. Sadly, in many cases, these schemes negated the temporal context and cultural use of space. Much of Africa has failed to live up to the promise of independence, prosperity, and her cities' modernist ideologies have crippled under the weight of oversubscription. The 80s into 90s saw the tail end of the progressive decades of city infrastructure development across the continent. The challenges here were that the prescribed notion that a continent alleviated from colonialism had to catch up with the rest of the world. In addition, regional infrastructure development prescribed by colonial governance continued to encourage rural to urban migration without upgrading city infrastructure to sustain this evolving densification. Tropical modernism can be criticized for not considering African society's multiple ways of life and cultural habits. Alas, the principle of the compound house. Modernism should have adapted to culture and not culture to modernism. Many projects of this period negated the natural flow and the use of space by indigenous communities in replacement for what at the time was considered to be progressive. Architects like Alan Vaughan Richards, a British Nigerian, were active in Nigeria's post-colonial architecture industry. Vaughan Richards incorporated the works of Nigerian artists in many of his projects. In addition, he engaged on the potential influence of African forms in architectural design through the publication of the journal, The West African Builder and Architect. Trained at the Architecture Association's London Tropical School in the late 50s, he studied cultural uses of architecture in Nigeria, and many of his commissions were hybrids of both influences. His house in Ikoyi, close to the Lagos Lagoon, was influenced by forms in the Hausa village and designed in a modernist style. He gained recognition for his work, which incorporated shared communal public spaces in his commissions. Demus Woku has recently been awarded the Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement at the Biennial Architectura 2023 that's been curated by Leslie Loko. An artist and architect who in the 50s founded an art society known as the Zaria Rebels, with a handful of other students, among them renowned Nigerian artists Bruce Emokpare and Uche Okeke. Their goal was to reintroduce indigenous ideas and forms into the post-colonial landscape, while simultaneously incorporating a few of the techniques brought by Westerners. This objective carried over into Nwoko's architecture practice, where he worked with local materials to create a new distinct design language. The project shown here is the Dominican Mission Church in Ibadan, and the building was completed in the 1970s. At the macro scale, the post-colonial African city's expression of public space is another example of cultural reappropriation. Traffic jams as active locations for trade, and the informal temporal markers of our cultural nuances towards this use of space. The need for communal draws relationships to the compound house and the layering between public and private. Scarcity, a condition we associate with modernity, has formed a basis for existence. By the 80s into 90s, we started to see innovations emerging from these conditions. Nifemi Bello's project, A Designer's Utopia, has been cataloging these collective contemporary knowledge of indigenous products brought about by scarcity. And now, I will share with you how I have applied Ashe in my practice. In 2020, I was commissioned by Lexus International for Design Miami to produce a series of design objects commemorating our times. For this, I collaborated with Chris Amwa, a textile designer, and we designed and produced a series of contemporary masks influenced by our African heritage. We drew inspiration from the interest in culture that referenced the continent, from Beyoncé to the photographer Christina de Middel's Afronaut series. We also drew inspiration from the unique urbanization of the contemporary African city, in addition to natural forms of fractals found in African culture. We decided that if masks were to become our new norm, it was important that they would be culturally relevant and fabulous. We designed 3 masks for this project, but I will only show one here to highlight these points. This design pays homage to Ogun, the traditional god of war, metal, and technology. The final design consisted of a face shield made from a vacuum-formed acrylic visor and a bronze or brass neck piece. Design involved traditional and contemporary technologies, from 3D printing and 3D modeling to the metal casting using the lost wax system, famous for its origins from the ancient city of Benin, which still has a long lineage of blacksmith families. After the casting, we created the scarification on the lower piece. The scarification was achieved in the same traditional means that the Ifa artisans would have used to produce this sculpture. This headpiece, possibly a portrait of a royal family member, is one of 18 Ife copper alloys unearthed in 1938. It's estimated that this sculpture was produced between the 12th and 16th centuries. This is the process which was used to create the scarification. And these are the finished pieces. These masks went on to be part of an influencer campaign, and at the time, when many of us couldn't travel, these masks went around the world. Janet Jackson was the last person to wear this mask. As part of my commercial practice, we created a minimalist seaside pavilion. The Lagos Lagoon's special topography means that a series of idyllic beaches and tropical stretches of leafy coasts are just a stone throw away from the bustle of the Lagos metropolis. The project sits on a slim strip of the peninsula outside central Lagos that is not accessible by road. This marks a stark contrast to the city with its busy life and fast pace. Here, we worked with and in response to the ecology of place. The reason why I show you this, it's not normal to see cows walking on the beach. But the point was, it's such a beautiful space, it was important to create an opportunity that framed views. In addition to this, we worked with color and material, which would complement the terrain. The pavilion was designed for a family who wanted a building for day use, often hosting celebrations and gathering around the pool. Open to the elements, yet protected from the sun and rain by its roof and pronounced overhang, the seaside pavilion makes the most of its alfresco nature. In this part of Nigeria, we have a very consistent south-north wind, which means that there's a constant breeze all day round, helping to keep the temperature remain cool. We had tried to emphasize and make the most of what was available from the structure's opening and overall arrangement. And here you can see we have a clean undergrowth span of 21.6 feet. As mentioned earlier, there's no vehicular traffic to this location. The logistics of moving materials brings its own challenges. In addition to this, we worked with a local contractor who didn't have the equipment or expertise to deliver such a clean contemporary structure. It was very important that we worked with him within the limitations without compromising our design to deliver a project we felt was fitting of place. As a practice, being involved in the process of making keeps us abreast of those capabilities and limitations of what we can achieve within the local construction industry. It's also important to note that working in collaboration with the structural and services engineers helps to ensure our aspirations can be achieved. The project structure was made from a combination of upstand beams spanning 6.6 meters and transfer beams of 13 meters to create the seamless open plan effect. The building is designed to take full advantage of the directional wind, and our location on the equator ensures that we have a consistent shade all year round. In the process of making, it was also used to approach the focal point of a dining table we designed for this project. Here, again, we wanted to work with the idea of creating a beautiful structure that would almost defy gravity. And we worked with aventurine crystals and colored concrete to create the overall form. Working again with a structural engineer, the table is designed to interlock and hold in place with its own weight. It was important to us to keep quite a large span. Here, we were able to eventually get the table to be 14.7 feet. All the pieces were made on the site, from the framework, which was carried across in a canon, to the casting of the base, taking the mold out, inserting the crystals in the white cement. Eventually, this had to be carried by about 10 men to be put into place. Remember, there are no machines. And then having the piece eventually polished. As I mentioned, color plays an essential role in this pavilion, from the calming aqua of the pool to the olive green accents in the furniture. Our uncluttered approach is enriched by green-colored elements that highlight various features. So, for example, the legs of the concrete table, as well as the canary pattern. Furniture made in Nigeria's east adds more local design roots to the project. And the floating coral pink deck complements elegantly against the golden yellow sand of Ilashe Beach. The United Nations Development Program Nigeria commissioned us to design a rehousing scheme with support facilities for community displaced across the northeast as part of Nigeria due to the Boko Haram insurgency. Boko Haram is an Islamic organization, militant organization, based in northeastern Nigeria, which is also active in Chad, Niger, northern Cameroon, and Mali. To put this in perspective, I am from Lagos in the Christian South, to Borno in the Muslim North, where there's heightened security concern due to the insurgency. In addition to this, Nigeria is a country of over 250 diverse ethnic groups. I had never been to the northeast of Nigeria, and with no prior experience, I approached this project with a clear emphasis on understanding its context. This is a Kanuri village, close to the location of the site, taken in 2001. This is the exact location in 2019. The community has been displaced for over a decade of extreme insecurity and conflict caused by the Boko Haram insurgency. Donations from Germany, the United Kingdom, France, and the EU funded this project. In addition, several Borno state government stakeholders needed to be satisfied with the design scheme. However, as an architect, my priority was the community as the end user. I immersed myself in the culture of Borno, specifically the Kanuri community I was designing for. I spent time with them at the internally displaced people camps, observing how they lived, worked, played, and interacted. I spoke to them about their ambitions and their dreams. And I've been reminded that irrespective of the lottery of birth, it is human to aspire for better conditions. I visited buildings that were built in traditional techniques, as well as other resettlement projects, to understand what had worked and what had not, so to speak. I paid attention to understanding the importance of culture and religious practice in order to design homes appropriate for use. And I listened. I was particularly fascinated with the Kanuri women and their intricate needlework in creating the Bam Bam cap. The Bam Bam cap is men's headwear worn with traditional indigenous dress for the Kanuri, but has become a favorite across Nigeria's many ethnic groups. With knowledge passed down for generations, these women are experts at creating tessellation patterns using a series of math sequence through colored threads. Each cap takes, on average, 3 to 4 weeks to produce, and the patterns are as diverse as the human thumbprint. My interest in this aspect of their culture formed a running thread through which I drew inspiration. In addition to my observations, I also researched the traditional building technologies and layouts. As in any Muslim household, there's an emphasis on separating the public and private. The image shown here is a zauri, a reception building where male visitors are received, and this room has no lines of sight into the open compound of the family, where the women have the household privacy. It was also important to carry out comparative analysis into traditional and contemporary land allocations for each unit, and find the right balance between land needs and cost of construction. The Zahuri and the compound house form the basis of the housing units in my proposal. Several other considerations were made. For example, the construction needed to be swift and delivered in less than a year as part of the stabilization scheme, prioritizing security that would return communities to their ancestral homes. We needed to design and specify within the constraints of speed and scale. As such, the building materials are all contemporary, but as a composition are respectful and acknowledging of place. The scheme required design to be climatically and prioritize the principles of cross-ventilation through the rooms and the roofing structure. The climate condition of Sahel savanna, with little canopy cover or shade, the Kanuri tessellation patterns as design inspiration were used to create much-needed shaded spaces. The provision for facilities to encourage economic reliance were provided to the community, like this marketplace. Education as a bedrock for society was also included. And here we see the first set of pupils in their crisp uniforms. The classroom facilities were designed to inspire and celebrate their unique culture. Where the insurgency's priority has been to stifle education, the provision within this development is at the forefront of counteracting the causes of insurgency. The police station is positioned as a place of convergence, physically and figuratively, as an essential pillar of security for the community. But I should highlight the importance of color for these buildings. As part of my early meetings with the community, I asked the Bale, who's the community head, what color preferences they would have for their homes. As color plays an essential role in our experience of space, I felt it very natural to inquire along these lines. As we sat under the Nim tree in a school built by the state government, he pointed to a color locally known as Abuja brown. In my research regarding traditional technologies, I realized that this was the color of the traditional walls using the local earth, and the expectation the community had was a yearning for the familiar. In this project, no paint was used to render the walls. We achieved this color and textured render from a combination of local soil, sourced from down the road, cement, and a bonding agent. The community moved into the homes in October 2022, and feedback has so far been positive. The long-term goal is that this intervention should foster development for a community, provide a sustainable platform for economic growth, and most importantly, give the people dignity by offering them homes that will provide members of this community cause to be house proud. It took the madmen of yesterday for us to be able to act with extreme clarity today. I want to be one of those madmen or women. We must dare to invent the future. What we can learn from contemporary Africa's challenges is a lesson on the importance that architecture cannot be the premise of a top-down discipline. The indigenous traditions of a region collective knowledge born out of daily practice and resolve are the innovations and ingenious coping mechanisms. Therefore, responding to a slight should not be the solution based on understanding of the environment alone, but on the cultural nuances of a location and attention to the material and the contextuality of place. Africa must not be seen to be catching up with modernism, but modernism with the continent. As the rest of the world faces similar scarcity challenges due to our urgent climate crisis, the continent's resilience is a case of an alternative approach. Our innovations are based on ingenuity, materiality, and contextual relevance. The challenge they face is their lack of asynchronous to industrialization. And this, the potential scaling of innovations, could be a pivotal towards our global solutions. And now I will present how I've taken this principle of Ashe into my role as the curator for the 2023 Sharjah Architecture Triennial. As I mentioned, Ashe, I am keen to frame identity and contextuality of place. The Triennial has given me a platform to converge like-minded practitioners. I am keenly aware of the importance of one's context, which has given way to an alternative view on sustainability, one that merits local materials and local appropriate architecture, which strays from Western modernization and the global style. Architecture needs to reference where it is from. It needs to be conscious of the environment, and it needs to pull inspiration from its context. And it needs to acknowledge its temporality to nature and its response to social constructs. Sharjah is a brilliant backdrop to highlight this positioning. As a cultural capital of the UAE, so much of what's being done is to amplify cultural nuances of the region. For the Beauty of Impermanence, we will explore design solutions built from conditions of scarcity and how these illuminate a pathway forward to reorientate our conversations on sustainability. Whereas the current global perspective on sustainability relies on technical innovation, this perspective prioritizes contextual solutions, resource sharing, and waste reuse. We will showcase examples of work based on a more foundational notion of regeneration and renewal that underscores an understanding of circularity that has been with us for generations. We will explore ingenious techniques, embracing the idea that everything is impermanent and subject to evolution and repair, that it is to work with nature rather than against it. I will share today some of the practitioners whose practice responds to this theme, but more importantly, these practices will be producing new work in response to this prompt. Wall Makers is principled by Vinu Daniels, who studied engineering. And before Wall Makers, he worked at the Arrowville Earth Institute for the United Nations Development Program post-tsunami construction. Their first project included a compound wall built from earth, which radically carved out a lot of local interest at the time. They have since devoted their energy towards the cause of sustainable, aesthetically striking, and cost-effective architecture. With a practice spanning about a decade, Wall Makers has received a lot of international attention, and in 2020, they won the Royal Academy Doffman Award, conducted by the Royal Academy of Arts, London. Abies Akili is a Jordan-Palestinian interdisciplinary artist, architect, designer, and cultural producer. Her practice is deeply rooted in the acts of memory, journaling, documenting, archiving, and collecting. And she views her practice as a social technology of cultural empowerment. Her recent work centers on indigenous Bedouin knowledge and practice to recover the intimacy of handmaking lost to today's production. She has regularly traveled to the Georgian Baidia Desert, where she engages Bedouin women tent making and textile weaving craftsmanship. Limbo Accra is a collaborative space design studio founded in 2018 by Dominique Petit-Ferrer and Emile Grib, to work on architectural and urban design projects and public art installations. Much of their work emerges from research, interdisciplinary engagement, and experimentation with the aesthetics and cultural significance of unfinished, decaying concrete structures in West African cities. The broader scope of their practice bridges the legacy of contemporary African architecture and youth development through social interventions with projects like the Freedom Park in Accra. MOE+A from Nigeria's principal by Papa Motayo, who graduated from the Welsh School of Architecture in Cardiff. Papa is an award-winning architect, designer, writer, and filmmaker, and his work strongly focuses on exploring the nature of culture and context within the contemporary Nigerian and extended African condition. A firm believer in creating work through cross-disciplinary collaboration and participation, he strives to find new possibilities for creating nuanced visual narratives in Nigeria's urban centers and beyond. Alboride is a practice from Ecuador, formed by David Barragan, Pascal Gontena, Marie-Louise Borga, and Esteban Benavibs. Their practice inhabits a territory of questioning, where certainties about what architecture should or should not be are under constant construction. Their ideas are developed in the making and with greater precision, the detail on site. They build from resources and techniques of the place, where the territory is always particular and unique and a unique variable. The project becomes an X-ray of the site, which speaks to people's customs, history, problems, and needs. The diversity of the project represents people's willingness to engage with ideas, take risks, and participate in decision-making. And so I round up by bringing us back to the principle of Ashe and its importance in architectural discourse. As practitioners and future practitioners alike, with a respectful consciousness for our environmental challenges and constraints, we must reorientate ourselves towards a culturally relevant architecture. We must be mindful of contextual materiality and tectonics, and the importance of adaptability of our buildings and urban landscapes to climate conditions. Can you see yourselves applying Ashe in your approach? Thank you.
Tosi, thank you for a great lecture and also showing the beautiful work. I think we'll take some questions from the audience. There might be some that's coming online first, but maybe I'll start off with one question to get started. I think before your lecture, we had a talk, and you talked about how Nigeria has changed since you left as a young woman and then going back. And I'm curious if your experience or your education in the UK or you're working in Rotterdam afterwards, how did it allow you, either through having a critical distance from that culture, from the Nigerian culture, or things that you have been exposed to that allow you to look back in the culture or cultivate that interest in a different way? I wonder if you can comment on that.
I do. First of all, I think it's great that I had a British education. I was allowed the opportunity to mature my ideas, but I think it's very important to build a maturity in the sense of being able to understand the context, whether it's from being immersed in it, from stepping away from it, but being able to define its importance and see it as a value. I grew up in a Nigeria where there wasn't necessarily a celebration of what our culture was, even though I was surrounded by it. But being able to become a mature designer, understand its importance, and being able to tap into it and to use it as a point of reference within my work, I think that came from being away and then being immersed back. But I think originally, as a designer, I was quite immersed in the idea of being able to represent my Yoruba culture. But what I loved about the project in Borno was I took the same principles that I had learned and defined within my space as a Yoruba girl, but then taking those principles to a completely different context and applying them, I realized how adaptable these principles were. And so it wasn't about me being a Yoruba person, it was about me understanding how to imbibe culture within my work.
And I'm curious also about how you see the role of modernism in your own work. Let's say if historically you talked about it being an agent for nationalism in the decolonization period, it was adapted as the Fry and Jane Drew's tropical modernism. In some ways, you also has this modernist strain in your work, not necessarily going back to the compound house as a point of departure from an organizational standpoint, but whether it's the Pool House or the United Nations project. I'm curious how you see modernism now in Lagos.
Again, it's so interesting because I think, and I will say this is the position I sit at now, and I might change my mind later. And I think it's important to know as a practitioner, as a theorist, that it's okay to also change your mind based on your experiences. I'm very much a child of modernism. My architectural background is within modernism, but my criticism of modernism is the fact that it needs to be more hybrid. And I think that's what I've been able to show in my work. It's very much modern, but it's very much conscious of culture and respectful of culture and adapting to culture, as opposed to early modernism, which was very much about importing a system into a region and not necessarily understanding how people use space. And I think ultimately as designers, we must always think about how spaces are used. It's one thing to create a language of transfer, of creating a space or spatiality, but are we ensuring that we're thinking about how it's going to be used and adapting our designs to what will work more appropriately for the people that we're designing for?
I mean, I as an observer to some of the work, I mentioned to you that when I saw your furniture, for independent of itself as an image, I assumed it to be a very different scale until I've seen pictures of people sitting in the chair. There's always something that is almost like a throne.
Yes.
The height of the armrest. Like some chairs, like the Barcelona chair, had that type of presence. As opposed to maybe an Eames chair that's much more fitted to the body. And your work seems to have that as even the house with the pool. I was thinking 21 feet, 21.6. The cantilever. But because it's not a light construction, it's a kind of heavy construction. It's both, but it's very different from the heroic tropical modernism of, let's say, Brazilian architecture. This kind of weight and contour. I don't know how to position it, but I sense it in some of the work, both in the pool pavilion as well as the table.
So,
yeah.
We like cantilevers, but I will say I was also very conscious when I was moving back to Nigeria that it was important to me to create architecture about experience. The thing is, buildings are all around us. There's no building within a city that hasn't had somebody design or conceive it. But how many spaces do you remember? If a space is well designed, when people walk in, especially people who are not from the profession, they don't need to know why they like it, but they notice. It's important. There's a subtle way you notice a well-designed space. And I think that's what we've tried to ensure comes across in our work. Now, talking about the chair and the conversation we had earlier, a chair is a very modern construct within an African context, because if you think about it traditionally, within an African household, you didn't sit on a chair. The only person who sat on the chair was the head of a household or a king or a chief. Everyone else sat on a wooden stool or on a floor mat, and you would go to the farm, you would work, and you would come back, and you would sleep. And so how am I able to imbibe elements of my culture within what is a very modern construct? And I think, it's this play of the importance of culture within space and modernity, and ensuring that culture continues to evolve. How do you continue to evolve your culture, build that identity, stay modern, but stay balanced at the same time? And I think that's very much where I've positioned my practice and the work that we've been doing.
I'm curious. So thank you for sharing some of the participants of the triennial. I'm curious how you curate the biennial beyond selecting, you an architect to create your buildings, create your pieces, a designer, and how do you operate as a curator in terms of not only the selection, but how do you orchestrate dialogues between the participants?
So this has been really interesting because obviously you started with creating the theme, defining the objective, and then finding participants who resonate with that theme. And we're now at the stage where we're refining what the proposals are. But what's been really interesting is, apart from most of these works, most of the projects are actually going to be new work, and it's new work responding to the theme but also responding to the location, which I think is also very powerful. And there is a dialogue, there's a back and forth. There's some projects that have come very easily, seamlessly, and others we've had to have a bit of there's been a bit of tension and pushing and pulling and refining. But I think ultimately the idea is that there should be enough consistency but also enough diversity in terms of the responses. Some projects are more based on a material exploration or technological exploration. Others are responding to existing sites within the city. We will have, I think, 3 or 4 urban intervention projects. Others are very much working within interesting materials. I don't want to give too much away, but it's very exciting what's coming up.
Well, I see you have a lot more curatorial experience than I did when I had to curate the Chicago Biennial. But one advice that I got was that from more seasoned curators was that on opening day, a lot of the participants would come and tell you how great the whole show looks. Everything looks great except my piece, which is true. I wish you better luck with yours.
Thank you.
So why don't we take some questions from the audience, and we'll have, I think Kat will pass around. Oh, Sarah.
No, it's good. Thanks. That was a terrific lecture. I have a question. Maybe you started to answer it with the suggestion of the urban interventions in the Triennale, so maybe getting a little bit more elaboration there. But you're in terms of your own work, so everything that we saw was non-urban except for your depictions of Lagos as a commentary. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, it sort of goes back to Malthus and the idea of speed and density, yes, sort of impinging on some of the traditional formations or spatial conditions that you've pointed out are so important to you. And so how do you accommodate that belief and that attempt to recreate this idea of spatiality in particular in a congested, dense interior that's imposed by not just modernity, but frankly, neoliberalism?
I'll be honest, this is the big question. And I think this is the point in case. And really, this is what I'm hoping to explore and to showcase in Sharjah, because that really is the challenge of the traditional in relation to industrialization, this need to move things forward. And if you look at it in relation to the African context, where you had a housing system or you had a building system that worked at a much slower pace, and then all of a sudden you're pushed into this process of colonization, and at the same time industrialization was happening, and these technologies couldn't follow suit, But we've gotten to a point which is really interesting, where within the African context, these proposals of progression were also halted because they were not further developed. But you've then got this bottom-up approach where we have solutions that are coming up that would have been very natural in their original state, but in relation to industrialization, they now appear to be overtaking systems that were not able to sustain themselves. And I think that it's within this funny gray area, that there are potential solutions that could exist, but not in the same context in which they existed previously. But this is the point where I feel there's something really interesting, and this is what I'm really at the point in my practice that we really want to explore. And that was why it was important to represent the Bruno project, because there's nothing there that is from the traditional. But it was a consciousness to try and replicate that across. That project had to be done in less than a year to house 500 people. So it just goes to show that if you think about it in a slightly different way, then there is a possibility of being able to apply it. Yes.
Thank you for the lecture. You spoke a lot about sort of culture and how architecture should kind of come out of people's culture. But I wanted to find out what you think about sort of exogenous factors like dysfunction and how dysfunction affects architecture. So Lagos, for example, there's a monograph titled "The Architecture of Fear" about how in the 90s, home invasions sort of started to shape architecture where people built first for security before any other thing. Smaller windows, so all of the things about cross ventilation just went out the window, pardon the pun. So that kind of stuff where when you don't have guaranteed power supply, you can't build sort of like tall. So the impact or the influence of those dysfunctions on architecture, I wanted to just hear what you beyond just culture and how we've lived for centuries, those exogenous factors like insecurity and stuff, how they shape, how should an architect kind of approach or deal with those kind of questions where it's beyond you, people just want to be safe first before they think of sort of like aesthetics and stuff, yeah.
I'll be honest, I think architecture is one of those professions that is always slow to follow pace. You have a point. I mean, I grew up in a house where you saw how the fence increased in height. It was this, and then all of a sudden someone's been robbed down the road, and then it goes up, and then someone puts glass spikes on top of it. I think for buildings that have already been put in place, obviously you have to adapt. But as a designer, it's actually your job to be conscious of what's happening, and you design accordingly. I'm not a firm believer in burglary proof, and we've gotten to a stage now in Nigeria where we're lucky we don't have to design with that so much in mind. There are other coping mechanisms. It doesn't have to be physical. There are ways you can design intangibles to be able to apply the same principles. It's the same way now in Nigeria. There is a system where people now have supporting staff. The original houses that were built in the 50s and 60s would not have had support facilities for household for support staff to live in your household. And what would happen is you would have a house, and at the end of the garden you would build a small BQ. Now as designers, because we've understood this is how people live, we design this into the housing unit. So it's the reality. Architecture must be able to be designed in such a way that you can adapt and change accordingly to changing use and needs of people. And there's a way you can design in security without physically putting barriers in place.
Hi, over here. Thank you so much. I think you brought such clarity to the proof of how to create something within the gray. And I've been very curious about modernity in general, but specifically how the project of modernity is very specific to realizing a particular notion of humanity that is antithetical to other ways of existing and is built on this very particular project of history. And it seems like modernity just is what it is, and your project and all the work that you do proves that hybridity is the form forward of trying to look at futures that can exist either through or in spaces in between. I'm curious, outside of the language of Ashe, what other languages have you developed, or can you point us to help us think through decoloniality without having to be precise or prescriptive about decoloniality constantly being derived or being in response to coloniality or whiteness? Like, what are the ways in which, like, talking about indigeneity and talking about tradition and talking about naturalism can exist without having to center or be in response to or being in negation to coloniality, if that makes sense?
I'll be honest, I don't think you should ever approach anything about it being positive or negative it is what it is. We've come through this. We are all a product of our environment and our experiences. I think we have to grow from where the elements that surround us. So I'm not really sure how best to answer that, but I've never approached any of this with a negative. It's about understanding where you are and being able to apply what you've got in a progressive way forward as much as possible. But I mean, we're all products of our history, whether we like it or not. You know, the city I grew up in is very much a colonial construct. But do I subject myself to that, or do I understand it, and do I pull what I need positive from it and move forward? I hope that answers your question.
Greetings, congratulations, and thank you for your wonderful talk. My name is Adejoke. I'm a visual artist, architect, also exploring indigenous Yoruba cosmology and terms within my practice. I'm curious to know or hear your thoughts about the current construction, design and construction of the J.K. Randall Center for Yoruba History and Culture, currently in development in Lagos. I believe the architect, Seun Oluseyi at CISA, also is weaving indigenous Yoruba ideas and concepts in his practice. For example, the design of the roof is supposed to be the shards or the ends of a woman's wrapper, right? Can you just offer your thoughts about that design and also where you stand as far as the concepts being generated by development?
So Sho is a very good friend. So I will be biased. I think it's a beautiful building. He did explain the ceiling, and I think apart from it being in relation to a wrapper, there's a lot of Yoruba mythology in terms of the alignment of the shafts within the ceiling space. But I think it's a brilliant celebration of Yoruba culture and a beautiful capsulation of interesting parts from different periods of history within the space. The building is about moving upwards, but he's gone from the 1500s, he's gone to contemporary history, and there's also a section within the exhibition which is talking about the future of Yoruba culture and its mythology and Afrofuturism. Leko Jaisimi has done a really beautiful piece within there, which is looking at Ife, and a beautiful essay was written, and he's created this amazing collage from it. But I think, you know, specifically when you think about contemporary African culture and Yoruba culture specifically, it's really important to have places like that that educate a younger generation about the celebratory notions about their culture. Because I think with everything, it's about layering of information. You know, once this is in a position or a placing, you know, people can build from it. But it's a striking building in the city. It's not been expected. It's finished, but it's not yet open. But I think it's a really beautiful celebration of an ethnicity, and we need more examples of that. Also, like the Benin Museum, which is coming up as well, which is being done by David Ajayi.
Hi, Tosin.
Hi, Mpo.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. First of all, I want to say that, you know, I was reintroduced to Lagos through you, and it was such a sensorial, orgasmic experience, and it's just so wonderful to see how your engagement with fashion, food, and architecture is just this beautiful synthesis across different formats. But my question is more around the question of materiality and technology. And I think that for me, as somebody who's not Yoruba, this is something that is fascinating, because there's something about the interruption of this kind of modern dream of modernity that, from my experience of Lagos, has produced an opportunity to invent things anew, or to insert certain ways of making and thinking. And I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit more on how attention to context and materiality might produce a very different mode of practice for you in Lagos and as a curator.
I think the great thing about there not being a clear trajectory is that, to be honest, it's really open for completely new opportunities of definition. I do think that, who knows, I think the possibilities are endless, but I think the freedom that you have within an environment where there isn't a very clear construct of way things are done is, I have the opportunity to further explore this in any trajectory that I want. But I can't say particularly that it's defined. But I think the fluidity of this environment means that the possibilities for me are endless. I mean, I think in Lagos, for example, we don't have structures or we have standards. You know, if I want to work with a carpenter today, I have the freedom to go down the road and it's not going to cost so much. You know, I have that opportunity to explore within this system that isn't structured. And it just means that I can really go in any direction that I want. But if you're asking me exactly what the trajectory is, it's really whatever I define it to be at this point. We have that freedom. You know, there's something really beautiful about having that openness of a canvas.
Thank you very much. That was very beautiful to watch and listen to. I have a number of questions. I think the first is, and they kind of intertwine, I think the first around public spaces in Lagos, Nigeria. We're seeing a rise where a lot of the beach areas are walled off from public view. And I'm just curious how you think about public spaces, parks, those kind of things in a place like Lagos, Nigeria, where that is consciously and quickly becoming an exclusive luxury. And just your thought around some of that. I think the second question is more around the micro and the macro. And what I mean by that is, it's great to build a beautiful property, but it's in the context of an entire city that could be entirely chaotic. And so building a thing in Rome, for instance, that has a certain kind of call of context, of consistency of that kind of culture, kind of jumps out and you get a sense of it. Like, it's like when you go on a tourist trip, but it's a bit different when you like go to a beach and you're like, oh great, such a burst of culture, but you step out and it's like tall wall of boring buildings all over again. And I'm just curious of how you think about that exactly in the context of the fact that there are not a lot of engagement of architects to build a lot in places like Lagos, Nigeria. It's just a lot of like what functionally works and is quick to get up, right? And I'm seeing that you've seen that a lot in commercial building. And I think the last thing I wanted to ask about was the interface between culture and religion in your work. You talk a lot about culture, a lot of it before colonialism, and I'm curious what the role of religion is. And one example I want to ask is if you've had cases where a client pushed back on a design you wanted to push just because of their religious sensibilities, or if there have ever been times when you thought that you couldn't reflect the cultures you wanted because it just won't be accepted in the religious context, e.g. juju and all that's right, all this kind of thing. Just a bunch of the things that I'm curious. It's just those three thoughts. Thanks.
Okay. So I think I only remember two, but I'll take the last one first. I think it's very important as designers. Who am I to impose on anyone's requirements as a client? That's not my decision. I might have my beliefs or my suggestions, but remember, as an architect, this is about balance. You know, it's a back and forth. We don't have the luxury as artists to just decide. Somebody's paying for it. So, you know, it's important to be able to read your client. There will be times when they will tell you things. There are times that you will sense it. It's a responsibility as a mature designer to be able to understand when to stop pushing and to take direction and hopefully create enough balance. And it's very difficult. It does take a while to mature your ideas on that. Talking about Lagos and city development, very sadly, but I don't know if it's sad, very sadly, a lot of the principles of urbanism that work within a Western construct have not worked within Nigeria. But I honestly sometimes believe that maybe those are not the right appropriate decisions for our urban landscape. And that's been the problem. When you have a system of modernism that came in and created a construct of how a city should be developed that negated the way the layouts would have worked, What do you expect? The system has broken down, and we have this bottom-up coming in, and it's changing the way things work. If you look at somewhere like Surulere, which was an urban area developed in the 1950s as a rehousing area to reduce the densification within Lagos Island, where they had issues with pandemics and all. There were cul-de-sacs built, there were beautiful landscaped areas, but they've been built over. The cul-de-sac has got a building in it, which was actually done by the state government because they didn't understand why there had been this green grass area in the middle that had been planned when there had not been enough city infrastructure, roads built to allow people to move out of the city. The easiest solution for them was just to build in all the green areas. So they didn't follow the master plan. But they didn't follow the master plan because culturally, they just couldn't see the rationale for it. So there are many reasons why our urbanism hasn't worked. And so people have readapted old cultures. It would have been very common in a compound house to have a fence. It's come back. So, again, so which is appropriate, which is, and maybe this is where we have to think realistically that some of the solutions to our urbanism and our architecture is not necessarily in an imposed system that has worked in other places in the world. We need to find solutions that work for our context. This is really important.
I hope on the last one, maybe not. You and I have talked about urbanization, and I believe you're the first one to tell me that, of course, the demography is showing that most people are leaving the rural area back to the city. But now, how is that going to be accommodated over the course of time? Inability to be able to juggle history, because folks in the rural part of Nigeria or other African countries are pretty much more attached to their historical background. How do you juggle the issue of modernism and then the issue of the historical context and then the culture? One thing about folks from African descent is the fact that we're quite attached to our culture, and that will continue, that tug of war on all these elements. How do you, because I don't know, maybe you have your performance metrics or some kind of scale that you use to balance it, because I'm looking at your work and what you and I have discovered over the course of time. It's quite challenging, especially when you throw the mix of colonization in it, and is Africa decolonized or not? It depends on who you're talking to and who is your client or whatnot. So how do you kind of bring your best out of all these elements? That's pretty much the crux of my question.
Oh gosh. Balance. Balance. There's no hard or fast rule. You have to sense it. It's balance. And as much as anything, I hope that what people take from what I have shared today is the importance of creating a hybrid. There's no one solution. It's not left, it's not right. It's finding an in-between, respectable in-between that creates balance.
We have time. Why don't we take a couple of questions from the virtual audience? One of them was from Karen McLaren. And the question is, what resource, whether living or non-living, pushes you to certain ideas within the region you're working in? Now, I know you also answered earlier about materiality. I'm curious if you can also expand on labor resources. Also, the range of projects you show were quite different, from pretty high-end houses to the United Nations project. I'm curious if the resource of labor affects how it affects the projects.
Ooh. I'm going to answer this in a little bit back to front way. Yeah. Something that I'm going to tell a story. Yeah. I hope it answers her question. I learned very early on when I moved back to Nigeria that if you want things done, you have to apply yourself in a different way. So, for example, if you send someone on an errand in Nigeria and you tell them something and they nod and they go and they do the wrong thing. And I quickly learned, write it down and tell him when you get there, give them the paper. And so learning how to cope within the peculiarities of an environment, ensure that you're always able to achieve things. And I approach this with everything, particularly with resources. For example, with the project at the beach, what I mentioned, this is a contractor that doesn't even have scaffolding. We've used bamboo, It's about ensuring that we give him the information in a format that he's able to work with, and we work with him to ensure that we're able to achieve what we want long term. But if you want to approach in a traditional way, you just sit as an architect, provide a set of drawings, and just expect things to happen, it doesn't. So you learn coping mechanisms to ensure, if this is my end goal, how do I want to get there? And you're able to apply yourself. And it's almost like you have to adapt to the system and not expect the system to adapt to you. And that's been my approach.
Thank you. One more question from the online audience from Ogden Ross, who asks, is Nigeria shifting away from oil towards green architecture, such that renewables and other systems like net zero lead? Can you supply enough energy-efficient housing for people of all economic strata?
So what's been really interesting when we look at sustainable architecture in Nigeria, we actually have probably been at the foreground of solar panels. You know, we don't have 24-hour power. And so a lot of these alternative technologies have been well embraced in our environment. We finished a project last year where the house is completely off-grid. And it's very commonplace. We don't have a central sewage system in Nigeria, so more likely than not, the state now insists that you create sewage treatment plants, you know, so it's all biodegradable, you know, you can use the water for irrigation. But these are not stories that are spoken about often, and I think it's important. That's a very good question, that we highlight these things. Systems that are more sustainable, more balanced for the environment are very much happening quite extensively within Nigeria, because we already don't have the systems that have actually contributed towards the pollution that we have globally.
I still couldn't get my head off your line, throwing cross-ventilation out the window. But thank you again. Thank you, Tosin. What a great talk.
Thank you so much.